here's the main point of this video. Hotter countries prefer spicier food because it takes less of it to satisfy hunger. And the key to understand the relation is in realizing that the hotter countries are also poorer. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now there comes a time in any person's life where they start thinking, why do the countries with hotter climates prefer spicier cuisines? Like have more spices in their foods. And such a time has come in my life as well some years ago, and I thought about it, and not without an external help, let's say, I've arrived at the conclusion that I'm gonna give below, alright, later in this video. So let's talk firstly about the spices in general. So why do we use spices in terms of like seasonings? Of course, okay, we'll mention this later. So why do we like seasoned food with spices in particular? Well, I'm gonna give you like a philosophical answer, alright? Through will to power, as usual, this Nietzschean concept. So basically, it can be easily explained through like the general concept of pleasure, with the help of will to power. And what is pleasure? It's overcoming the resistance, alright? Or in terms of will to power, manifesting your will to power over something or perhaps even someone. In some cases, if you know what I mean. By the way, like, so in terms of seasonings, like, you know, mild food is like easy to eat, so it gives no resistance. So we add some resistance to it, so it becomes like harder to eat. And therefore we feel more pleasure, like the food resists us, if you wish. So ultimately a seasoning is a poison, right? Like we're poisoning ourselves at least to some degree. Even the salt is a poison basically, but we kind of like it, you know, because without it, like the food is too easy, you know, like it's too easy of a catch. And see my video Bad Ending, where I describe this in a bit more detail. I'll link it in the description, where I examine like the nature of masochistic pleasure in the first place. And like seasoning may be considered like a subset of that sort of pleasure. Or you may look at, I mean, there are millions of examples you can think of. Like look at how cats play, for example. Like cats do like moving stuff, right? Because the stuff that is just there, it's not interesting, right? Like, when a cat sees that, like, I don't know, a rubber ball just sitting there, the cat is bored and it starts even like moving the ball itself, right? Like, and then it becomes funny and you can chase it and etc. So this is the resistance, right? The ball is moving, it's harder to hit, etc. So it's more pleasant to play with, right? All right. Of course you might say, well, there is you might go over the top and poison yourselves too much, you know, but, that's a whole different story. Okay. So let's go to the general topic of this video, since we've already examined, why do we need spices in the first place on the fundamental level? Why do we enjoy them rather? But in general, there have been a more or less standardized explanation for why spicy foods are more prominent in hotter climates, and it hinges on this, natural selection type of explanation, which means that spicier foods are safer in the sense that there are less parasites in them, because less harmful bacteria, etc., because spices do kill these whatever parasites or unwishful I don't know, whatever symbiotes with the food, right? So it's a preventative measure against infection, essentially, the spices, that is. And in terms of some foods, you might say this actually makes sense. If you look at sushi, this proverbial example with wasabi, yeah, it kind of makes sense. However, I mean, in terms of sushi, it's a whole different story. But anyway, it does make sense to some degree, in some respects. I do agree with that. However, I believe that the general, like the main reason is different. And let me start explaining it through a personal anecdote. So I've been to Lake Como in 2017 to a conference. It was like Let's Face Complexity, it was called. So there I've met a Mexican guy who also attended the conference, and during one of the intermissions, like we've sat outside this villa where we've been at Villa del Grumello, at the on the coast of the lake, basically a very beautiful place actually. And we sat there and like just was casually chatting, right? And I've asked him, like, because I was curious, like, you know, about Mexican cuisine and stuff. We've talked about music and various stuff, but in terms of cuisine, I've asked him, like, the question that was actually bothering me for quite a while, like, why is it that in such a dry climate and hot climate as in Mexico, but it can be generalized, obviously, which is what we're doing, people prefer spicier foods? Because, like, my argument was, well, spicier food makes you thirsty, right? But if your country is already dry, it's not very, like, the water is not very abundant, so it doesn't really make sense to make you thirstier in such a situation, right? That was my argument, and I didn't understand what's going on. So he thought about it a little bit and said, well, maybe the reason is that when you eat spicier food, it actually makes you feel full with less food that you've eaten, all right? And at the time, it didn't really make sense to me because, again, it doesn't really address the counter-argument I've had, right, about the thirstiness. So, but eventually, when I thought about it, I've realized that this is actually the case. And I'm pretty sure you've also had these experiences that I certainly did when, like, I prepare some, like, I've actually made pasta many, many times, and if I add too much pepper, let's say, like, I just can't eat much of it, you know? Like, I'm getting, like, satisfied in terms of hunger with much less of it, all right? And you've probably encountered this as well. So yeah, I've realized that this is probably the case, like, he was right. Yeah. So here's the main point of this video. Hotter countries prefer spicier food because it takes less of it to satisfy hunger. And the key to understand the relation is in realizing that the hotter countries are also poorer. All right? So the idea is that, roughly speaking, the poorer you are, all right, the less food you can afford, and therefore you use spices to feel more full, even with less food, basically, right? So it's actually a pretty straightforward idea. And yes, it would make you more thirsty, just, you know, as my initial counter-argument was. But, well, water is actually easier to find, after all, than food, right? Water is much more abundant than food. On this planet anyways. So yeah, overall, it's a beneficiary trade. You know, you trade some extra food that you don't have for some spice plus extra water that you may have, actually, right? So this is the whole shebang about the spicier foods. So yeah, this would be my explanation. And I talked to the guy in 2017, all right? And have come to this realization soon after. But later, lo and behold, some people have actually came and made a statistical analysis of various cuisines all over the world. And I'll actually link the paper from 2021, all right, in the description. So their conclusion is exactly the same, that there is a clear correlation between the GDP of a region and the mildness of its cuisine. So the poorer you are, the more spices you use, and vice versa. Like the richer you are, the less spices you use. And again, it's like sort of like on average, you know, it's like There's a big table. Maybe I'll show you the picture from the paper. Like, I'm not sure if I wouldn't forget. I'll try to do that. So yeah, there is a clear correlation. And so hence, this seems to be the primary defining factor, actually. Of course, there are other factors. Yeah, sure. Cultural, again, you might say, sometimes religious, sometimes whatever else. I mean, people may prefer like some special type of dish in a certain time of year, etc., etc. So there are many, many factors, but this one seems to be the primary one. All right. Okay. So yeah, there are three other things. So this is kind of the main idea of this video, but there are still three other things I wish to talk about, at least briefly. So first of all, it's like, why do people use spices besides from, just using it as a seasoning? Well, firstly, it's obvious. It's a preservative, right? Again, it kills bacteria and whatever else. So the food can be stored much longer, right? So salt is obviously the most basic preservative of this sort. But actually salt is and has been historically like used for many other purposes as well. So it was a very useful commodity, right? And by the way, salt itself, like, there is this proverbial, like, salt was more expensive than gold, which is rubbish. And here I'm going to reference DEBUNKS' video, which I'm going to link in the description. It's actually a hilarious video, so I recommend you to watch it. So anyway, most of the price of salt, which was sold, no pun intended, at the marketplaces, came from taxes, actually. Taxation is robbery. Right. And obviously other spices are used as preservatives as well, such as, I don't know, pepper, cumin, mustard, ginger, and whatnot, right? So this is one thing, spices as preservatives. Another thing is like the historical aspect, if you wish. So in Middle Ages, historical and political probably, partly, in Middle Ages and ancient times as well, spice trade was obviously a big thing, right? It was where, well, maybe not the most, but a lot of the money was circulating, right? So something just happened with my curtain. I hope nothing was ruined. So yeah, a lot of exploration and colonization efforts were definitely inspired by spice trade. And by the desire basically to control the sources of the spices, right? Of various exotic plants and sometimes animals as well. So Europe, for example, had, well, maybe relatively abundant food source, right? In its own agriculture, but didn't really have spices, so they had to be imported from other places. Not only spices, but other stuff like the holy trinity of, like coffee, tea, and cocoa. And obviously we also had like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco imported from Americas. By the way, like, can you imagine like Italian cuisine of early 16th century? Like, it had no tomatoes, and like, what? Like, you can't make pizza without tomatoes. You can't make pasta without tomatoes. It was an entirely different cuisine back then, right? Well, of course, again, most of the people were dirt poor, so nobody really cared about this. Like, bread was the main thing, actually, right? So, or you can think about potatoes in my country, in Belarus. Like, we're by far, like, the #1 country in the world in potato consumption per capita. Like, we're almost like twice as much in this index, twice as high as the second place. So yeah, no potatoes, no Belarus, something like that. What is actually curious is this spice in Frank Herbert's Dune, right? Why did he call it spice? Well, it definitely like was inspired. Of course, it's also called melange, but it's definitely inspired by this spice trade of like age of exploration and like the Renaissance era and stuff. Like, you know, there people like navigated the cosmos with spice, while on Earth we've navigated the oceans for spice, right? Something like that. Not only, obviously, but including this. All right, and the last thing I wish to note here, which perhaps might be of interest to many of you, is that this running topic of the coming famine, right? Which I've already mentioned in my video on Ukraine, by the way, link in the description. And in my Skype talk with Jim Wenninger, we mostly talked about like Newton and science, also linked in the description, but we've touched on famine as well. So there have been for quite a while this vegetarian propaganda, you know, obviously, which was supported by the governments in terms of like preparation for war, right? Preparation for rationing. Like, you don't have to eat meat, you know, you have to be satisfied with simple, like, plant-based food. So, specifically, the British government did this. But now, people are concerned with, for example, insects, right? We're gonna eat more insects now, and, like, I see all kinds of like crazy people on Facebook feed. Like I already said that my Facebook feed is really an interesting place to examine the modern culture at the very least. So people are freaking out that we're now gonna get propagandized to eat insects, not just plants. Like vegetarianism is already an old age. Now we're eating insects instead of that. Well, I have to disappoint you, or maybe like actually inspire you, like, how do you say, encourage you, that actually insects are dying out at a really rapid pace. Like they're dying out much faster than anything else on this planet. All right. And maybe I'll link some study on this in the description, but it's really terrifying, to be honest. So I would say it's a bit of a stretch that we're gonna be propagandized to eat insects anytime soon. I mean, there are just not gonna be enough insects, to be honest. I mean, if you like exchange, let's say, like roughly speaking, cow farms into insect farms, then maybe. But yeah, you'll have to like completely redo all the logistics in this sense. So I don't know. But my point is, insects are dying out rapidly, and therefore, like, it's unlikely. Okay, and yeah, like one of the, like, in case you're wondering, like, why that might be the case, well, there is a hypothesis which I actually think is sound, is that it's due to electromagnetic pollution, if you wish, due to electromagnetic wireless communication that we use. But maybe not only, maybe the power lines, transmissions as well, because they also generate especially in the ultra low frequency range, electromagnetic waves, right? Like 50 hertz or whatever is the frequency. So yeah. And specifically about bees, right? There was like a documentary called something like Electromagnetic Beings of Frequency, something like that. But it was about the huge decline in bees populations, right? That we observe in recent decades. All right. Even Black Mirror TV series played on this, where they've had these artificial robotic bees, right? And of course, the actual like developments in this area are being made, etc., etc. But yeah, I think this hypothesis actually holds water, so to speak. All right. But my prediction with regards to this video is that if some global famine is really gonna start, let's say in the next 2 years or 10 years or whatever, then we're gonna start eating much more spices, all right? Exactly because, as I've said, the main reason why people eat spices is the lack of food. They are supplementing the extra food with spices plus water. That's what is going on, essentially. Okay, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.